And his books have taught me so much about America. And I'm sure many of you are here because you've read Independence Day, published in 1995, his Pulitzer Prize winner, or Let Me Be Frank with You, his 2014 Pulitzer Prize finalist, or any of his other wonderful, wonderful books. And reading Richard's books has taught me a lot about America and who we are. And knowing Richard and being in his classes at the festival and other places has taught me a lot about life and a lot about writing. So I know you're in for a great, great treat today. So please welcome our friend Richard Ford.
That's as close as I'm going to get to that podium. This is not a, thank you very much. No, I'd rather not. Thank you. This is perfect. Thanks very much. Thanks for coming. I just arrived last night. I live in Maine, but I still am happy to say I keep a house here, which is one of the joys of my life. Susan and I would have said, Susan, that we've known each other for 35 years. I don't know, because I think long before Christina and I moved to New Orleans, I think we were friends before that. But, you know, Susan is not an institution in this town, and she's not a fixture in this town. She is Susan Larson. But the truth of the matter is that if she weren't Susan Larson, and if Susan Larson didn't live here, this would be a different kind of place for writers. So please thank her. I think I spent much of my early life in this hotel. My father kept a room in this hotel for a long time, and often before he got sick and after, certainly, I was in one of these rooms here, perched someplace. I think I may have been conceived in this hotel. I'm not sure, but Ron Pincus, who is a wonderful man, also a great friend of writers, who runs this place, has kind of, you know, seized upon what are the assets of New Orleans and the assets of the South to make it kind of a literary place, which we're all grateful for. And I don't come in this place without thinking that I belong, and everybody else who comes here feels the same way. I think, although I can't be certain, that Eudora's story, No Place for You, My Love, actually starts here and ends here. I'm not sure. I never asked her. I should have asked her, but she probably wouldn't have told me the truth. I want to say to you that this, one of the signifiers of this music stand, means that this is not a lecture. This is meant to be interactive. So what we're going to talk about, and you've got in your hands now what we're going to talk about, is meant to be provocation for you all to ask questions and to interrupt something that I'm saying. And if I say something that doesn't make sense to you, I want you to wave your hand in the air, and we'll say, you know, that's what this should be. And I'll say this too. My rationale for being here is not so much the rationale of books and prizes and things like that. It's to use myself as a specimen, really, a specimen which serves to prove that people who write novels, sometimes really good novels, and who start from ordinary beginnings, are just ordinary people. And that through the somehow the sort of torque and alembic that art is, narrative art in our case, out of that rather ordinary stuff can come wonderful things. And so I don't like it that books are revered and therefore writers are revered, because we don't really, by and large, need reverence or deserve it. So some of you in this room probably write. I'm sure I'm not the only one, and I know I'm not the only one. But I would just like you to feel not discouraged, but encouraged by being here and talking about literature in the ways that we will, which are kind of plain spoke ways. On the list that you have, what makes a good writer, a partial and not impartial listing, you might wonder why there are only 13 entries. Because that's all there are. It's these 13 and that's it. You get these down, you got it. What I'm going to do is, I'm just going to go down through this list, and if you all don't say anything, we're not going to be here very long. So these are things that I think are pertinent to being a writer and to being possibly even a good writer, and an interest in language. Well, you know, we all say if we grow up reading and if we want to be a writer, we always say, well, you know, I have an interest in language. Well, what for a writer does an interest in language actually mean? It means a number of things, one of which is that exposure to well-chosen, felicitous language is where the rubber meets the road for reading. You can say, I think, long before you talk about narrative structure, or long before you talk about point of view, or long before you talk about anything that we think of as the formal properties of a piece of imaginative writing, we go to literature to be exposed to language. That's what we do. And so for me, what I think I'm doing by and large is not developing themes or not making characters. What I think I'm doing is I'm trying to write a good sentence. And if I can get you to read a good sentence and like a good sentence, then you'll read the next one, and on and on and on like that, you know. And what mostly reading and making good sentences is about choosing words. That's what we do all the time, we who are spending our lives as writers. We're choosing this word over that word. We write a sentence typically, and in the middle of that sentence is a word we don't like. And so then what we're doing in for the next 2 hours or 2 weeks or a year is trying to plug that hole with the right word. Mark Twain said the difference between a well-chosen word and a not well-chosen word is the difference between lightning and a lightning bug. And that's real, for me, that's really it. And sometimes you just have to live with the lightning bug. Sometimes your resources just really run out. I think that our moral and ethical obligation starts really with Mallarmé's remark, which is that it is for writers to renew the language of the tribe. We are, as writers, stewards of the language more than we are anything else. And the ethical and moral consequences of that are many, and they are chiefly that when we have difficulties in our lives, when we have difficulties with our wives, with our husbands, with our boyfriends, with our children, it often comes down to saying something that isn't understood properly, or hearing something that wasn't said in the first place. So that the stewardship over the language is a moral stewardship, because it has consequences in terms of what good gets done and what not good gets done. Once, speaking of Mallarmé, you probably know this little anecdote. It's not even an anecdote, just a snippet. The painter Degas, who used to live out on Esplanade, came to his friend Mallarmé and said, you know, I have written a sonnet, he said, and it's full of wonderful ideas. And Mallarmé said, my friend, sonnets are not made with ideas. Sonnets are made with words. And then many years later, Delmo Schwartz comes along, wonderful poet Delmo Schwartz, and he said, you know, though, he said, but that's true. He said, but sometimes words can lead to ideas. And that's exactly how discovery occurs in literature, by the choosing of words, often choosing a word that you didn't necessarily expect to be choosing. Wittgenstein said that the world we live in is the words we use. Now, what I'm going to do, I brought this big book. I thought it wouldn't be right if I didn't read something to you. These are Updike's early stories. If there was ever a guy who chose words, it was Updike, who was a pal of mine, and we'll talk about him a little bit more later. But I just want to read something to you that he wrote from his stories that are called the Maples stories. And this is just a paragraph about about how a writer goes about defining something, defining, in this case, love, with word choices. Mr. Maple loves Mrs. Maple. He goes through the troublesome periods, often on Saturday afternoons, of being unable to take his eyes from her, of being captive to the absurd persuasion that the curve of her solid haunch conceals and wraps a precarious treasure confided to his care. He cannot touch her enough. The sight of her body, contorted by one of her yoga exercises in her elastic black leotard, riddled with runs, twists his heart so that he cannot breathe. Her gesture as she tips the dregs of white wine into a potted geranium seems infinite, like one of Vermeer's moments frozen in an eternal light from the left. At night, he tries to press her into himself, to secure her drowsy body against his breast like a clasp, as if without it he will become undone. He cannot breathe in this position, yet maintains it long after her breathing has become steady and oblivious. Can love be defined simply as the refusal to sleep? Also, he loves Penelope Vogel, a quaint little secretary at his office who is recovering from a disastrous affair with an antique one, and he is in love with the memories of 6 or so other females, beginning with a 7-year-old playmate who used to steal his hunter's cap, and is half in love with death. He as well seems to love, perhaps alone in the nation, President Johnson, who is unaware of his existence. Along the same lines, Richard adores the moon. He studies avidly all the photographs beamed back from its uncongenial surface. Now, I just want to go back through that paragraph and just point to some chosen words, which I made clear that I thought riddled with runs is nice. Here's another one. Her gesture as she tips the dregs of white wine into a potted geranium seems infinite. Okay, tips is good. That's a word you have to choose. But you get to the end of that sentence, and here's what I try to do if I'm ever a teacher, is to try to get myself somewhere between the end of the pencil and the page. And so for a student, the sentence goes, her gesture as she tips the dregs of white wine into a potted geranium seems blank. The typical writing problem in choosing words and in championing language is to get the right word at the end of that sentence. And what you have to, in a way, to do is develop a kind of muscle memory to know when a sentence is leading you to the moment that it will give you the opportunity to choose a good word. So what John wrote was, her gesture as she tips the dregs of white wine into a potted geranium seems infinite. Infinite. I mean, it could have been 5, memorable. No, it's not very good. That's a lightning bug. All right. That's all you get about language for the moment. Behind curtain number 2 is oppositional thinking. What oppositional thinking means to me, fairly obviously for you, is to question everything that you write by proposing its opposite, which causes you to have to get your brain, somehow in between conventional wisdom and the page. Because conventional wisdom will take you right through a sentence and not ever make a good sentence for you. So in other words, you have to sort of take on, and we'll talk about this word subsequent to now, we'll take on a sense of authority about how words find themselves to the page. I have a student who came to I teach at Columbia, who came to my office the other day, and she said, would you help me? I thought, well, and she said, I'm writing an essay for the Columbia magazine, she said, sort of in response to the Me Too phenomenon, we'll call it that. And she said, and my piece is about what are the things that women don't talk to other women about? Sounds pretty good. Sounds pretty good. What are the things that women don't talk to each other about? It wasn't about what men don't talk to each other about, but that's another subject. And the first thing I asked her was, do you think that it's good that women should talk to each other more than they do? And she said, well, yeah. I said, well, why do you think that? She said, well, it just seems to be true. I said, why don't you ask yourself the question, maybe it's not good for women to talk to each other about more things than they do talk to themselves about. Maybe, in fact, there are certain kinds of issues in anybody's life that are worth lying about, that are worth keeping private, in fact, that are not talking. And that's what I mean by oppositional thinking. When you go the other way against where your instincts lead you, when you go the other way against what conventional wisdom tells you, then you crack open the issue in a way, and other language is then available to you. And then you will find yourself saying something that you didn't know you were going to say, which you can write. I mean, it's writing is a victimless crime. When you write something on the page and you don't like it, you can take it out. It's an indoor sport. It's nothing. So what I'm always trying to get people to do is to say more, is to find opportunities to say more, because as I said to you previously, I think that exposing people to well-chosen language is what we're here for. So if I can get you by this device of oppositional thinking to just take whatever you understand to be a given and say, maybe it's not a given, then you have the opportunity not necessarily to do any original thinking, you might or you might not, but it gives yourself the opportunity to write more, write something that you didn't expect yourself to be writing. No one's saying anything. No one's asking any questions. So we have about, please, go on. I read. That's what I do. I read. I read all the time. The only reason I'm a writer is that I was a reader when I was young. I wasn't a good reader. I'm dyslexic, but there were certain advantages to being dyslexic, which maybe we'll talk about. But reading. But I mean, there's just something to be said too for over many years, which I've been doing this now, 50, about a mindset which says to you, for every new book that you embark on, or every sentence that you write to your colleague at Columbia, or any short story or an essay, I need to be better at this. You don't ever get to such an age as a writer in which you don't say to yourself, I need to be better at this. I'm not as good at this as I hope I will be. So it's just a sort of function of dedication. I mean, I hate to fall back on an axiom like that, but it's nonetheless true. Nonetheless true. But it's a good question, and thank you for it. All right, number 3, thoroughness. And by thoroughness, I don't mean, I'm getting tired of this. It's not your fault. It's just me. I can't do this. I don't belong to you. Yeah. Thank you. Get a little higher. I was here when I was a child. And it works about as well as I do. All right, thoroughness. And by thoroughness, I'm not just talking about catching typos. As I said a few moments ago, to be an author means that you authorize everything. You authorize every period. You authorize every word choice. You authorize every paragraph break. You authorize the first sentence in every new chapter. It's all on you. And so, for lack of a better word, thoroughness seems to seems to meet the needs. E.L. Doctorow was my teacher, and he was a good teacher, although he didn't bring to bear a huge erudition, although he had it. Mostly what he did was teach me how to conduct myself as a man who was going to be a writer. But the one thing that he said to me back in 1969 that has stuck in my mind, even the moment he said it, was that in the back of your head, when you're going over something that you've written for the 19th time, if you hear a little voice or if you feel a little something, a little titillation back there that says no, you have to listen to that. You have to listen to that, because this is your most precious work. This is your life. This is the way you're going to make a difference in the world. And so as many times as you have to go over something to get it finished, and I have to go over things a lot of times, being dyslexic, I'm always looking around to see things that I feel are not quite good enough, and you have to have just the temerity to go back to it and go back to it and go back to it. I mean, it makes being a writer at that particular stage in the life of a book, when you're really sick of it and you've been doing it for about 4 years, it makes it kind of a clerical hell. But at the same time, Thoreau has a wonderful remark. He says, and this is probably, if as much as anything else, the difference between a person who is a writer and who's not a writer. Thoreau said, a writer is a man or a woman who, having nothing to do, finds something to do. So when I'm taking the time that is required to pore over this stuff and listen for that little voice in the back of my head that's saying no, 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 or maybe just no, 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 I don't have anything else to do. That's just what that's what my life is, and that's the difference between a profession and a vocation. Those of you who are Catholic, surely there must be one of you left in here somewhere. Those of you who are Catholic understand the idea of a vocation. It means that what you do for a living doesn't run on a track different from the track that your life runs on. A vocation means you can say it comes from the Latin, it means a calling. But what that really means is your life is your work, is your work is your life. So when you identify that, and when you can identify that, then you have plenty of time to do this, because you're not doing anything else. You're not going to the law office. You're not going to work at Ochsner in the morning. Please, yes, ma'am. I've never felt it. Well, I wouldn't have said it if it weren't true. Yes. So, I hate people who begin sentences with "so." What you're saying is that level of attention and thoroughness can sometimes act as a kind of a stopper to progress or a stopper to thinking. I just don't have any solution for it, because I don't buy the kind of romantic notion of naturalism in imbuing art. I think art is always artificial. Art is always made. It's not, for most of us, natural at all. So that fundamentally, there's nothing that gets in the way of your forward progress that is relatable to attentiveness. I never thought that I could have a writer's block, because I wasn't smart enough to have a writer's block, or I just decided I don't have time for a writer's block. My experience is that when I am writing like Topsy, and the words just falling onto the page as well as they could ever fall onto the page, versus those days when I am, having a hard time, when I'm struggling, when things aren't making sense to me and I'm having to put sentences together with difficulty. When I look at the pages later, it's about the same. In other words, those great days when everything feels splendid turn out to be just about as good as those awful days when things did not feel splendid. And there may be a lesson in life in that little paradigm. I don't know. But I guess what I'm basically saying to you is forget about that. You can forget about all the bad things you've done. You can forget about this. Or I'll put it to you another way. Te absolvo, okay? Not at all. Number 4. We making any progress here? All right. What if you're Baptist? Well, you shouldn't be in New Orleans in the first place. You're on the wrong side of the river, bud. Well, that's different. All right, charging on. There are 13 of these. Number 4, interest in the reader writing for others. As I said to you earlier, this is not rocket science. I only write because I read. I'm sure that in my young reading, I read something which elevated me, which told me something I couldn't have ever learned anywhere else. And what it born in me when I had that experience was the thought, gee, wouldn't it be nice to be able to do that for somebody else? So that my fundamental feeling about my thoughts of readers is that I'm trying to write something which will be useful, and useful in the broadest sense. I don't know if you know Walter Benjamin's essay called The Storyteller. It's a wonderful essay, one of his more sort of admissible essays for regular readers such as I. But he says that all imaginative writing, storytelling, it's about storytelling, should find some way to be useful to the reader. And once you say that something has to be useful that you do, then the reader's implied. I mean, there are certain kinds of foolish arrogances in which people say, oh, I only write for myself, or I don't care what the reader thinks. Baloney. Believe me, at 74, I would not be writing books if I didn't feel like somebody was going to read them. And I don't think, even when I didn't have a readership, when I was 23, someplace, even though I couldn't have articulated it as I do now, I know that I wouldn't have written anything if I weren't going to show it to somebody to be read. I mean, that's the, what Duchamp said, it's the spectator who makes the picture. I don't really think that it's the spectator who makes the picture. I think Duchamp makes the picture. I mean, Sartre says that that a piece of writing is not beautiful until it escapes its maker. That may be closer to true. That its beauty lies in its efficacy, in a sense. Its beauty lies in its destination to another, which basically I think is the ethical underpinning of a lot of writing. We do this for others because we can. All right, number 5. A disinterested use of language. I'm always happy to use the word disinterested since it's basically going out of existence now, even in the New York Times. Now disinterested has come to mean uninterested, which unhappily it never meant before. Disinterested means actually impartial. It isn't a synonym for uninterested. Uninterested means I'm not interested. But the notion of interest is a mercurial notion, but disinterested use of language is what Fry meant. And what he said was in an essay, I don't know if you know Northrop Frye, he was a Canadian, from Moncton, New Brunswick, interesting man. He said that writing is the disinterested use of language. You must have nothing writing on the outcome. Writing is a disinterested use of language. you must have nothing writing on the outcome. And what that means is that you don't, when you sit down to write a sentence, you're not trying to prove anything that you already know. You're just trying to see where sentences will lead you and then to take responsibility for that when you see what you write. And when you achieve that level of disinterest, when you don't have the interest involved in partiality or in trying to prove something foregone, then your opportunity for finding wider ranges of language is much enhanced. There's a wonderful biography of Robert Lowell written by Ian Hamilton. And in Hamilton's rendition, Lowell had the same situation facing him, as poets do all the time, as novelists do all the time, of writing a line in a poem in which the word in the middle was the wrong word. And so what Lowell did was kind of look at the ceiling, look at the thesaurus. Don't ever let anybody tell you can't look in the thesaurus. You can look in the thesaurus, look at the dictionary, ask somebody, whatever are our resources on the ground and on the spot that we use to find words. And he kept looking for words, looking for words, looking for words, couldn't find the word to supplant and replace the word he had in the middle of the sentence. So what he finally did was he put not in front of the verb. And when he put not in front of the verb, it reversed the meaning of the line. But for Lowell's purposes, it added a beat to the line. And when a beat was added to the line, then he liked it. Even though what he thought he was writing was the opposite of what he was finally going to stay with. And that's what a disinterested use of language means. That you are willing, back up to oppositional thinking, you are willing to let something, through the agency of language and choice of words, help you discover something that you didn't know you were going to discover. Yes, ma'am. He thought so. He thought so. I mean, you could look at both versions, and you probably, I don't think it's in Hamilton's biography. He thought the line was a better line. And then what you have to do, if you see that you have a better line, you can decide to take ownership of it or not. It doesn't mean if it's a better line and it absolutely abrogates what you thought you meant and don't like what it says, then you cannot use it. But what you're basically doing is you're trying to invent strategies in writing to give yourself something to say. And this gave him something to say. It just wasn't what he thought he was going to say. And we're trying to let language sort of crack open intellection in some way. And that's one way of doing it. And Frost had a wonderful line. He said, poetry is the last vestige of our childhood. We must go at it somewhat irresponsibly. And that's what he meant. That's what he meant. But I'll just stop here and make a distinction. Because I just wrote a memoir, was published not even a year ago, about my parents. When you do those kinds of machinations to discover a word, putting a not in front of the verb in which you reverse the meaning of the word, well, then you have nothing writing on the outcome. You're just happy to see just exactly what that sentence now says. And maybe you like it. Maybe it shows you something you didn't expect to be shown. When I'm writing about my mother, and I'm writing a sentence in which I come to a line in a sentence in which I have to use an adjective to attribute to my mother, and I don't like the adjective that comes onto the page first, I am not a disinterested writer. Because what I have to say is, when I find the word, irrespective of how I go about finding it, I have to say, yes, but is that true of my mother? So it's a facility that works for fiction that is entirely different when it comes to choosing words for nonfiction. Nonfiction has a whole different set of reliances, a whole different set of obligations and ethics, and so it's worthwhile to say that, because I don't want you to think that you can just say anything you want and who gives a shit. It's not what I think at all. Because when you get that line, even in a piece of fiction, you get that line and you look at it and it's the reverse of what you thought it meant, you still have to say, yeah, but do I think that's right? Yeah, but do I? Because you're the author. Do I think that's true? With writing about my mother, it was different. Anybody have anything on her or his mind? Nothing. Okay, good. All minds clear. Number 6, the conviction about the importance of what you're doing. I always try to counsel everybody I know to write about the most important things that they know. And partly that's because I don't have time for anything else, because I'm not any good at small talk. I always want to talk about the most important things I know. I want that to be right in the forefront of my mind all the time. I don't think the world has much opportunity to just piddle around and talk about stuff that doesn't make any sense. It's also the case that if you're writing about the most important things that you know, love, betrayal, death, life, childhood, parenting, all these large, $5 words, then you have a much better chance of keeping somebody interested in what you're going to say. Because people understand that something matters here. Something is at stake here if you're writing about childhood, or if you're writing about being a parent, or if you're writing about love or inconstancy, all of these things. Randall Jarrell said a wonderful little line. I don't know how you read Randall Jarrell anymore. He's just a wonderful poet and a wonderful critic. And for me, it was such a wonderful line. He said, talking about writing a good poem. Jarrell said, when I write a good poem, I am good. And what he means by that is that he comes to the agency of writing that good poem. He comes to inhabit for a provisional moment, that moment in time that the poem is in him, to know what good is. Stephen said we gulp down evil, choke on good. Good is not the thing we're mostly in touch with. So for me to write about the most important things I know gives me an opportunity to inhabit good for that moment in time that the poem, the story exists. Cyril Connolly said that the true function of a writer is to write a masterpiece. And I tell that to my students every day, every class, because my thought is that if you're not here trying to write a masterpiece, why are you here at all? 7, getting fully expressed. Yes, ma'am. A masterpiece.
How does that correlate or pick the right word?
Disinterested use of language.
Yeah, like you said, you write it with something running on the outcome.
That's right.
Yet you're writing a masterpiece.
Those two things don't seem mutually exclusive to me. They do to you, I realize. They. Well, we'll have a dyslexic embrace later on. All I can tell you is that procedure by which you write sentences that you were not expecting to write, always in the process of trying to write a better sentence, a sentence that says something different and better from what you thought you were going to say, is entirely consonant, in my understanding, with what you finally adjudge to be your best effort and in the intense effort to write a masterpiece. I mean, tell me if you don't mind my badgering you just for a moment. Tell me why those two things seem incongruent.
Because when I think of not having anything riding on the outcome, I don't care about the outcome. And if I'm writing a masterpiece, I very much care about that.
Okay. That's well said. That's well said. I would only say to you, and this is completely personal. It's not a teaching moment. For me, it's all high chips. For me, everything's on the line all the time. I wouldn't be doing this if I weren't trying to do something excellent. So no matter what my day-to-day procedures are for choosing words, underlying all that is an immense investment in the condition of literature.
So the disinterest is simply in choosing the correct words, going back to, I think, the first point.
or a word that you feel is different from, better than the word that you would have chosen without that intervention of that oppositional thinking. But if nothing else, okay, if nothing else, it's worth keeping those two things in your mind for a while, seeing if they don't somehow reconcile as you think about them. Because I don't think they're irreconcilable, though I understand why you say that. I wish my Columbia students would ask questions like that. Yes, yes, ma'am, please.
I just wonder if that touches on the writing of a what you want.
I'm not trying to ever make anything universal. No. I think if I were committed to making things universal, I would be taking my eye off the particularities of things that I'm best at. I think something becoming universal is both a quality of the work itself, unplanably, and it's a piece of serendipity that the rest of the world sees in it with the reason that I did it. But if I were to widen my lens so as to try to make everything, potentially universal, I would miss the things that I care about, because I think that the things that I care about are minute things, are small things, are everyday life things, or moments in time that I capture by writing them down in my notebook. I mean, there's a lot of in Felix, at the beginning of Felix Holt, in which George Eliot, who writes the introduction to her own book, says all private, and she says it's about writing political novels. She said all private lives are determined by a larger public life. All private lives are determined by a larger public life. So that means that if we're writing about private lives, they have the capacity to radiate out into the larger conversation, into the larger sphere of understanding. And so that's what I count on. It doesn't happen very often, nor I suppose should it. But thank you for those. Fully expressed. When Updike died, Updike's been on my mind recently. I'm not quite sure why. But Adam Gopnik wrote in the New Yorker an obituary and an appreciation of Updike. And one of the things that Updike did, Gopnik said, was that he managed to get, over the course of his life, 1933 to when he died, he managed to get himself fully expressed. And I like that line about Gopnik because it in a way is instructive to me. And by that he does not mean that he got all of himself onto the page, because that's not what he was about. What he meant was that he got everything that was important to him onto the page. And some of that would have had to do with him. Some of it would have had to do with things not personal to himself. In a way, that sense of exhaustiveness, of getting everything that you can think is important into a book or into a story or into an essay is to me a credit then to the essay and the book and the story itself. Here is everything that I know and care about on this subject, and that adds, I think, to its appeal. It adds to its importance. And again, it may be about you, or it may not be about you. It may be something that you just fall heir to, or just happen to know because you heard it on the subway. But getting fully expressed is, it seems to me, to be a way to make yourself confident that you've put as much importance as you can onto the page. And for me, that's everything. Please.
In going inside and finding those things that are important, whether they're large or they're anecdotal, seems like it's sort of like fishing. It's like you throw in your line and somebody grabs onto the piece that's universal to them. And when talking about Updike, I know that for me, I left home that I loved in Pennsylvania when I was 7, and somewhere around 14, I read an essay that he wrote, and he said when he left his home in Pennsylvania as a child, he closed his eyes so it remained with him forever. And that is exactly what I had done. And it was that was my first experience of understanding that by someone else going inside themselves, a small anecdote, but what was important to him was also what was important to me. And that was when I first understood why being a writer was such an intimate and important thing.
It's certainly what I think was an intimate and important function of life for Updike, for sure. And the trick then is to try to make, as you're implying, that importance transmit to someone else. I mean, Ruskin and some, I think some modern painters, his essay, middle of the 19th century, said composition is the arrangement of unequal things. Composition is the arrangement of unequal things. And what he means by that is that all of these things that are important to you don't fit together. They're just a snippet here, a grabbed line there, an overheard remark there, a thing you think here, a way something smells, or how the light falls on the carpet. But you write those down, you keep those things, and one of the things that you do is in composing something and making a novel and trying to get all of that stuff that you think is important because you've looked at it and you've looked at it and you've looked at it and you know it's important. You know you want to keep it. You know you want to use it. Fitting those things together is what makes a novel. And the degree to which those things both don't and do fit together constitutes some of the torque and dramatic intensity of a novel. How you make them fit together. Yes, ma'am. She got herself fully expressed. Or several. Why bother? I think that in fact it affects a lot of people, a lot of people, and I don't think that there's any reason to think one writer's life is comparable to another writer's life. You know, one's life doesn't teach much to another. In her case, that's what she thought, so she can't be wrong. And if I wrote one great book, or somebody else in this room wrote one great book, what I would think is that just makes me encouraged. It just makes me feel like maybe there's something in me that I can do better. I mean, I'm just, I'm just committed. I don't have a real progressive view of history, but I do have a progressive view about myself, that I need to get better. So that, just a different world view. Hers was that she was as good as she ever was going to be, so why bother to write another book? Yeah. Number, am I missing one? No, lack of competitiveness. I just put this on the list because I think it's important, because competitiveness can drive you crazy. And also because Fitzgerald said that he cannot do well unless his enemy does less well. I don't have time for that. I don't have time to be looking that way and looking that way. What I think is that all boats rise on a rising tide. And that when anybody does well, if any of my colleagues, even the ones I despise, if they do well, it's good. Don't bother yourself with that invidious competitiveness. It's not necessary. It won't make you better. It'll just make life shitty for everybody, including mostly yourself. But I know people who are competitive. Maybe it's because I was a not very good athlete when I was young, and I was also, because I was dyslexic, a kind of bad student. That competition for me was never really anything I did well at. So like all things that we do, we try to find ways to stress the things we're less good at, and work hardest at them. So I think in some ways I worked hard for a long time, not holding my colleagues' good luck and good work against them, and I'm happier for it. I don't, it should be said, I don't have more friends because of that benevolent view. I think the course of life, and I wrote an essay in The Guardian about this last year, I think the course of life is mostly a course that leads you to fewer and fewer and fewer and fewer friends. I don't care. Number 9, a willingness to say the unsayable. I like this. And I'm not talking about saying inappropriate things. I'm not talking about using words which will scandalize or hurt the feelings of. I'm talking about what Samuel Johnson wrote back in the middle of the 18th century. I'm talking about this. Johnson said, "We all know what light is, but it is difficult to say what light is." That's the thing I'm trying to get people to write into, in saying the unsayable. Emerson, in his essay on nature, says, "Nature doesn't like to be observed." And it's a memorable line, but then you have to think, what does it mean? What does it mean nature doesn't like to be observed? It's not true. I see all kinds of things about nature that are perfectly observable and sayable. You know, crocuses come out in the spring. Lions eat people. But what it means is that you are trying to give language to, give voice to those things that you think are native to human beings for which there is not an acceptable or conventional language. You are trying, as Updike did, to define love. Octavio Paz had a wonderful little snippet of a poem, just a fragment. He says, "Between what I see and what I say, between what I say and what I keep silent, between what I keep silent and what I forget, between what I forget and what I dream is poetry." And what he means is he's making a kind of a little spatial metaphor, experiential metaphor for the unsayable being in the interstices between things, in the interstices between seeing and saying, between forgetting and dreaming. Yeah, he makes it up, okay? But he's trying to locate it for us, that there is something that is worth giving language to. We sense that it's there. There is something ineffable about being alive. And in a way, all people who are writers understand that ineffability about being alive. And that's the use that we try to put our work to give language to those things that are sensate, maybe at a very sublime level, but yet we feel if we can articulate them, give language to them, give body to them, they will be important and we will be better for it. What I'm always doing with people when I'm talking to them about their work, when I'm reading I could show you in the Updike passage again. When Updike gets to that moment in the line when he has the last word to say, and that last word is infinite, he could have had he probably did have a lot of other possible words. I call those pushes. I think that those are moments in writing a sentence in which the writer pushes something. It's very hard to get young people to do this because they don't want to make a mistake. And if you're in a writing workshop, people are going to be pulling their chins if you come up with the wrong word. Forget that. Push. It's when you push at the end of a sentence. It's when you push at the, shit. I do want to read this to you. It's got another line here. This is not going to go on forever, I promise. 452. When he says, he cannot sleep in this position, yet maintains it long after her breathing has become steady and oblivious. Can love be defined simply as the refusal to sleep? For me, that would qualify as a push. He adds that to a description which was already quite adequate. And he pushes because his muscle memory, his intellectual muscle memory says, here's an opportunity at the end of this line in which I can provisionally define what love is. And so it was before he wrote that, defining love as the inability to sleep, it was unsaid. It was the unsayable before he said that. Number 10, obdurance. Well, you can tell that I'm just natively an obdurate. Oh, yes, ma'am.
Can I ask for a repeat on the poet's name and can you repeat the silence?
Octavio Paz, Mexican, Nobel laureate. And his little ditty was between what I see and what I say, between what I say and what I keep silent, between what I keep silent and what I forget, between what I forget and what I dream is poetry. Anything else? Am I missing anybody? I'm not looking up enough. Obdurance, as I was about to say, you can tell I'm an obdurate person by nature. You have to look up, see what obdurance means, of course. It means a kind of a hardness. And I am just that kind of a hard guy. And I'm just that way by nature. Being a writer did not make me that way. Being briefly in the Marine Corps did not make me be that way. I just came that way. But I'll tell you, it has its virtues. When I had written 150 pages of the third book I ever wrote, which is called The Sports Writer, I thought I had 150 pages I could sell. And so I took it. We were living in, I don't know where the hell, Massachusetts, I don't know, Montana. Yeah. So I took it to New York, and Ray Carver had been a great friend of mine, was my closest friend. And he said, you need to sell this book to Gordon Lish. And I don't know if the words Gordon and Lish together mean anything to you. He's a horrible man. but a very famous man, and very famous for being horrible, but very famous for also being Barry Hanna's editor, and for being Don DeLillo's editor, and for being Ray Carver's editor, and being a lot of people's editor. So I took my 150 pages to Gordon Lish at Knopf. And he had said to me many times in the previous years, he said, Ford, you need to be well published or you're never going to get anywhere. You need to let, he used to always refer to himself in the third person by his last name. You need to let Lish publish you, he said. Lish will put you on the map where you belong. And so I thought, okay. So I took Gordon, Gordon's still alive, amazingly enough. Stanley Elkins said when John Gardner died, there is a God, he said. So I took my pages to Gordon and I gave it to him on Friday afternoon. And Monday morning, he called my agent and said, I'm not going to publish this book. He said, you tell Richard to put this book into a drawer, into a desk, and to lock the desk and burn the desk. And I was already at a moment in my life when I thought, and my agent had said this to me. She said, Ford, if this book doesn't work, you are toast. Those are her words to me. And I thought, well, shit. And so I was a young man, and I was in a precarious position with my writing life. I felt and knew, and it was shocking to me. It felt like a real defeat, and so I took it back from Gordon, and I didn't work on that book from Christmas 1982 to June 1983. And during that time, what I did was persuade myself that he was wrong. And that's why I say that obdurance is a virtue for a writer. If you don't like obdurance, you can say resilience, okay? If that falls more easily on your tongue. But I just think that a certain amount of bloody-mindedness is necessary. And it's not always necessary. It isn't that you have to go forward every day with that as your banner. But I do think that at some point in the writing of good books, in the writing of serious novels, you just have to tough it up. And so sometimes when people say to me, gee, it must have been hard to write that, I say, no. Brain surgery is hard. Flying supersonic jets is hard. Writing novels is not hard to do, but it requires a certain kind of hardness in yourself, a certain kind of obdurance in yourself to do it. Yes, ma'am. Yes, please. Well, that's a question I really can't answer. Because I couldn't take out. I didn't tell you the whole story. He read about 20 pages of 150, and in the week after he called my agent, this is long before email and long before there was tight security in these buildings, I'll just come where you are. So I just went where he was, into his office, and I said, "You little bastard," I said, you didn't even read this book, did you? He said, "I read enough of it." I said, how much is enough of it? He said, "I don't know, 20 pages, 25. He said, "You can tell if a book's any good by the first 20, 25 pages. That's what he said to me. And so I didn't have a lot from him to cast shadows on the work that I had done. So even though I can't really specifically remember what I did when I went back to it in June of 1983, I think I probably stayed my course by and large. You can't unexperience that. So who knew? Who really knew? But he didn't give me any comment about it. He just lied about it and basically failed at his job. Yeah. But that's that's the same kind of question, and it's a good question, and it's one that you have to reconcile with yourself. At the end of every day of writing, you stop. You try to stop at a moment when you think you know what you're going to say next, and so then you go to sleep and you have a life, and then the next day you come back to your desk and maybe you remember what you were going to say, but by and large it's probably always the case that you would not say on Thursday what you thought you were going to say at the end of the day on Wednesday. Not exactly. And that can drive you kind of crazy, but you can't let it. Please, yes, ma'am. Yes. Bien sûr. It would have been another world. Yeah, absolutely. Sure. And I went to him full of hope. I went to him full of confidence that he was going to take me on and be my publisher and and publish and edit my books. So, I'm not a Presbyterian, but I can act like one. So I can believe that things worked out for the best, as they did. They just worked out how they worked out, and I tried, because I'm obdurate, made the best of them. But yeah, it would have changed everything. It would have changed everything. And I can't say it would have been for the worse. When I started trying to be a writer back in 1968, I had other possibilities. I tried to get a job as a sports writer for the Little Rock, for the Arkansas Gazette, and they wouldn't give me a job because I didn't know how to do it. But I've always thought, or if I'd stayed in law school, if I stayed in the Marine Corps, I've always thought that if I'd stayed in the Marine Corps or stayed in law school or gone to work for the Gazette and been a sports writer or been a lawyer or been a career soldier, that would have been fine. That would have just been great. I wouldn't have written these books. I wouldn't be sitting here now. Maybe I'd be dead, but because it was Vietnam. But I don't look at the world that way. I don't look at the world as you know, as it's in a way that I can't control it. I try to let the world be as uncontrolled as I can. And that was pretty much just fortuity, just fortuity. All right, number 11, write about what interests you. I put that on the list because it goes against the old chestnut about what Hemingway said, write about what you know. If I had written about what I knew growing up at 736 North Congress Street in Jackson, Mississippi, I maybe would have written 2 or 3 sentences. I didn't know anything. And moreover, I didn't know I knew anything. And when I started trying to be a writer with the first book I wrote, I thought that it was my obligation to write about the South because I was from the South. I was from Mississippi. I'd grown up down here in New Orleans and Jackson, and that's what I knew. And I wrote a book, and I thought, well, my God, I'm going to write this book, and it's going to change the whole way people think about Southern literature. But it did not. What people said in reviews, when I still read reviews, which I don't anymore, was a quite good Southern novel. I thought, no, that's not what I wanted to do. And so I thought, all that I know about the South, I've read in Eudora and in Faulkner and in Flannery O'Connor and in Peter Taylor and in Calder Willingham and in Richard Wright. That's all I know about the South. I don't know anything original at all. So the only way I'm going to be able to make a writer out of myself and I wanted to be a great writer. I didn't want to just be some piddly-ass guy filling up pages. I wanted to be a great writer. I take C.L. Connolly's injunction seriously. I thought, I have to write about something else. And I made that decision in 1982. And I was living in New Jersey. And I thought, when I looked around, literally, what do I know anything about? Whether I was born there or not, whether I grew up hearing it or not. I thought, I know a lot about New Jersey. So I'm going to write something that is set in New Jersey and that has some of New Jersey as its subject matter. And when I did that, I did that little thing that I described earlier about a disinterested view. I cracked something. I cracked a little conventional integument over that subject. And what I found was the ability to generate language. Had nothing to do with anything that I knew about. I was not writing about what I knew. I was writing about what I could appropriate. I was writing about what I was interested in. I was writing it because I was desperate for needing to have something to write about. And that is a subject and a practice that has to extend to all other subjects. You know, there is in university life these days the notion of cultural appropriation, in which we are advised that if we are not gay, we should not be writing up gay characters, or if we're white and we're writing about African Americans, we don't know enough. That is something that is not true and cannot be allowed to stand. It is anti-art. We have to be willing to appropriate anything we want to appropriate. Because who's to say that me, an old white guy, can't write something, who's straight, can't write something about gay life in America that wouldn't be worth reading? Because that is the imagination. And to say that you can't write about these people, you can't write about that person, people write about me whatever my little category is. Everybody feels free to write about me. But you have to be willing to embrace the world in that way with your imagination and with your intellect. And people are not going to like it, and they're going to tell you that you shouldn't do it. And what you have to be is obdurate. Henry James, in one of his wonderful prefaces, and if you've never read James's prefaces, I hope you will read them. I think it's in the Theory of Literature. At the end of James's practical writing life, around 1903, he rewrote all of his novels and wrote prefaces edited them, basically. and then wrote prefaces for all of them. And these prefaces are wonderful. They are absolutely spectacular. They're not particularly Jamesian, like Portrait of a Lady is Jamesian, so that the sentences, even though they're slightly riddling sentences, they're not as riddling as they are in the Golden Bowl. But James says in one of his prefaces, he says, the terrible whole of art is free selection. That is to say, what you choose to write about, what you elect to bring to the page is a fearsome decision, and it must be made as courageously as you can make it. Now we're almost to the end. To stay on the theme of Henry James for just a moment longer, in his preface to his little short novel called, well, it's a novella really, it's called What Maisie Knew, What Maisie Knew, James says this. This is under the bracket of bliss and bale. James says, there are no themes so human as those that, there are no themes so human as those which, out of the confusion of life, show us the connection between bliss and bale, between the things that help and the things that hurt. There are no themes so human as those which show us out of the confusion of life the connection between bliss and bale, between the things that help and the things that hurt. What that means to me is that the two masks of drama are connected at the back, and that the smiling side and the grimacing side are part of, if not one visage, part of a complex view of the world. And I'm thinking about writing a book about somebody who has ALS. Not sure I'm going to be able to do it. I haven't tried yet. And I keep saying to myself, this has to be funny. This has to be funny. This has to be funny. And what that means is that in getting yourself fully expressed, in getting as much as you can onto the page, you have to understand that conventional wisdom, which tells you that everything about this is sad and everything about this is happy, are in fact joined somewhere. And that the complexity of life involves both. I wrote a book, the second book I ever wrote. There was a man named Walter Clemens, lovely man, dead now, gone, who was Eudora's first literary executor. I was her second. And he was a reviewer for Newsweek magazine. And I wrote this book, and he thought it was okay. But he said to me in private, he said, you know, the thing I miss about this book of you, he said, is that your sense of humor is not in this book. And I thought to myself, although I've not been 100% successful at it, that everything that I want to write has got to take advantage of everything that I can do. And that's part of getting fully expressed. And that one of the things that I can do is that I can be funny on the page. No matter how serious, no matter that I want to write about the most important things that I know, I want to find something, some access on the page for bliss and bale to coexist. Because when I do that, I think, just as James says, there are no themes nearly as human as that. And finally, the line at the bottom, what do I have there? Leavis's definition of literature. I don't think anybody should go out of this room without being able to answer the question of, what does literature mean to you? Because believe me, I get asked that question all the time. And so F.R. Leavis, in an essay that he wrote about D.H. Lawrence a long time ago, Leavis was a literature professor at either Oxford or Cambridge, I can't remember which, I think Cambridge. He said this in the essay that he wrote about Lawrence. He said, literature is the supreme means by which we renew our sensuous and emotional life and learn a new awareness. Literature is the supreme means by which we renew our sensuous and emotional life and learn a new awareness. That is to say, that's what happens to the reader when a reader reads a novel, reads a poem, reads a story, reads an essay. Thank you.